I would like to take this opportunity to officially welcome you today to today's webinar, Leadership in Turbulent Times. Joining us today are Bob Sutton, Huggy and Kaye Foster. Bob Sutton is a professor at Management Science and Engineering and professor of organizational behavior at Stanford. He co-founded the Stanford Technologies Ventures program and the Hassel-Plattner Institute of Design, better known as the D School. Bob received his PhD in organizational psychology from the University of Michigan and has served as Stanford faculty since 1983. He's a senior scientist at Gallup and academic director of 2 executive education programs, customer-focused innovation, and the Stanford Innovation and Entrepreneur Certificate. Huggy is an Atal McBean Professor of Organizational Behavior and Human Resources, Graduate School of Business, and Professor by courtesy of Sociology at Stanford University. His most recent book, co-authored with Bob Sutton, is Scaling Up Excellence, which is a Wall Street Journal bestseller and was included in the Best Business Books to Read in 2014 by Financial Times, Inc. magazine, Amazon, Forbes, Washington Post, and the Library Journal. His research has been published in numerous scientific journals, and he has served as the editor of Administrative Science Quarterly and has been a member of the editorial boards of American Journal of Sociology and Organization Science and Academy of Management Review. The thing is that these guys, I could go on and on about them. They have lots of acronyms behind their names, but I just think that they're really solid human beings, which is why we're so excited. I'm so excited to turn this over to Bob and Huggy, and they're going to be introducing our guest star and someone we are very pleased to have joining us today, Kaye Foster. Welcome.
All right. Thank you, Robin. So welcome. So I'll start out and introduce Kaye, which we could spend the whole time introducing Kaye, but we'll get on with the conversation. And I'll ask her a question, and then we'll get rolling. And keep your questions coming in. We'd love to see them. Okay, so Kaye, first of all, had a long and distinguished and actually complicated career as a senior executive. Perhaps most famously, she was head of HR of Johnson & Johnson, kind of as there was some downsizing needed. So she's been in that kind of crisis. Then, when I first met her, it seems like about 7 or 8 years ago, I first met you, Kaye, actually in lovely Sonoma County. She was part of an amazing top management team at a pharmaceutical company called Onyx that, as I recall, you all grew it from a $500 million to a $7 billion company in just a few years, which ain't easy in pharma. And then they sold it. And Kaye's sort of become kind of a board member, and she's on all these boards. I probably can't remember all of them. Well, she's on Stanford Health's board. She's on Spelman College's board. She's chair of something called Glide Memorial, which is an amazing operation. She's also on a private company board, Agios, if I'm probably mispronouncing that. And she also works with Boston Consulting Group, advising CEOs and other senior executives. So for the first question, since Kaye is she's at ground central with all these senior executives and other companies and organizations dealing with COVID. So Kaye, what's the big advice that you're giving to those executives you're talking to? What do you tell them to help get them and their organizations through these times?
Yeah, so good morning, guys. And thanks, Bob and Huggy. These are 2 of my favorite people to work with because they're real people. That's what I really appreciate about them. So in terms of the work with CEOs, and this is CEOs across all of the various platforms that I work with, whether that's philanthropic, whether that is public or private company. And it's 3 things I've been telling them. The first is really what I call this pause, because we are in this moment where there is such an intensity around doing something, making a statement, putting yourself out there. And one of the things that I've really asked them to do, the first thing to do is to pause. And in that pause, the way that I describe it to them, we're in this moment of character, not content. And so many companies have really made their mark and are valued for their content, what they do. I mean, I use Boston Consulting Group as an example. We are a strategy firm. We're known for our depth of research or rigor or analytics. But like so many other companies, we are in this moment that it's about our character. It's about who we are. How do our values actually shape the decisions we're making? And therefore, in this pause, how can we be intentional about how we plot a path forward? So the first thing is pause. The second and quite frankly, I've told leaders that to consider this moment, this pause, as a gift. And if you think about this as a gift of a pause, how would you actually best use that gift in service of your mission? So that's the first thing. I would say the second thing that I tell them, and Bob, you and I and Huggy talked a little bit about this, how do you focus on what's critical and versus what's least important? Because you will tend to do what's least important because you know, that's right in front of you. That's the easy stuff. How do you really get to what is critical, and how do you then deploy and get after that? So those are the two things I start telling my leaders to really focus on.
So let me do a follow-up question, and then Huggy, you can jump in. So I love the 2 bits of advice. Do you have any ideas? You know, this idea, of course, you should focus on what's critical, not just other things that are sort of distracting. Are there any hints or patterns that you see with executives to get them away from the stuff that is taking all their time but doesn't matter, to get to the more important stuff? Because that's one of that idea of dealing with the cognitive load and their attention is one of the hardest things for any leader. So how do you get them to the right place?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'll give you some examples. I mean, I'll do that throughout because I think that's the way to make this come alive. If I think about, and I use this example with them, if I think about 9/11, I happened to be in New York. I was in New York in the city that morning for a follow-up visit because for a postnatal visit, I had a 4-week-old baby and a 2-year-old baby in New Jersey with my sister, and I happened to be in the city for a postnatal visit. And I was at the time, I was head of HR for Pfizer for a region we called JALA, which was Japan, Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America. So a pretty broad swath of geographies, but I was on maternity leave. And to the point of what was critical, what was interesting about Pfizer, we were right in the city on 42nd Street as this unfolded. And what was interesting about Pfizer, they had always said what really mattered most to them was their employees. And in this moment, I saw an organization get really clear that the order of importance, number one, was, first of all, finding out where their employees were. We had employees deployed all over the world on planes. We had employees in different parts of the country. And the first order of business was, let's locate all of our employees and make sure they're all safe. The second order of business was communication, setting up a communications command center so that as a company, and that was our headquarters, we could get information to help us understand what was actually happening relative to our employees. And then the third, interestingly enough, then was business continuity. And I think that may surprise people that the first thing they didn't think about was business continuity, but it was consistent with the values of the organization. The values of the organization was our people. And therefore, you see it directly going towards living into those values. So it's back to the point I made about this is a character moment. What I say to them is, what do your values tell you as really matters in this moment? I'll give you one other example. Spelman College. I sit on the board of Spelman College. And as you could imagine, in the middle of Atlanta, navigating through one of the most challenging, not just pandemics, but all of the social and racial unrest that's related to that.
Just crazy.
And then an economic crisis for the college, right? As a historically Black college and university. And our priority has always been excellence in education in its broadest context. It wasn't just the academy, but it was also the experience that these women, many of them first generation African-American women, or I should say Black women of the diaspora, that experience of being together on campus and really being able to have an experience that was all around confidence building, really making sure that we were building whole women, not just focused on the academy. And with that as our priority, we started down a path of really saying, how do we move to a virtual experience that delivers that same level of academic excellence in its entirety. And that led us initially to say we would consider bringing first-year students physically onto campus as the only individuals who would be on campus. And what happened over time is our priority wasn't just, or our critical issue wasn't just about the academy, it was also to be balanced with safety. And as the weeks progressed, it became clear that we needed, and it wasn't that we were thinking about the academy in the absence of safety, but safety became the most critical priority for these women, for our staff, and for all of the people who would be caring for them because of the way in which the pandemic was unfolding in Atlanta. And I think that's the other learning I tell them. It's not that you're straying from what matters, but you've got to be adaptable and flexible and be able to pivot where necessary. So make a long story short, we've now pivoted, and we just announced at Spelman that we will be completely virtual for all attendees in the fall. And that's a tough, I can tell you that is a very difficult decision to make as an academic institution where so much of what we deliver, our value proposition, is about that in-person experience.
That's tough. Huggy.
That's beautifully described. Okay, thank you again for being here and for sharing your wisdom. I'm still thinking about your wonderful point about making a pause or pausing. And the reason I'm fascinated by that is most people, when they think of crises, they think the thing you need to do is respond very fast and very quickly. And what I hear your advice is, hey, don't go fast, pause, reflect. I find that wonderfully counterintuitive. Now, listening to you, and particularly as you talked about the rich example of Spelman College, it seems to me that people try and simplify crises. Is that a sensible thing to do? How would you provide ramps to people for them to understand, hey, this crisis is a little more complex, and you want to improve their understanding but not overwhelm their capacity? How do you reconcile capacity on the one hand with what the organization ought to do? Can you, share with us some examples of that, please?
Yeah, it's interesting because your point about the tendency to want to move fast, this sense of urgency. One point I'll make about that is I've talked in this moment with leaders about compassionate urgency. So I am not suggesting that you not act with urgency, but you see, we have made urgency equivalent to speed. And for me, you can absolutely act with compassionate urgency because it means you absolutely have a sense of urgency. In that pause, you are really making sure that you are, what is the right order to take those steps in? And any system that you are leading, are you bringing the appropriate level of care and attention to that system? So I talk about compassionate urgency. I am not asking people to not act with the appropriate sense of urgency. But urgency doesn't mean speed for me. Urgency is about deliberation. It's about this sense of compassion, and it's about this sense of being thoughtful about how you move forward. So I don't, I want to make sure that people don't hear that I'm not suggesting you don't move with urgency, but that you absolutely move with urgency. Your second point about capacity, I use the word capacity as opposed to capability. And I'll tell you why, because in this moment, the tendency is, let's just throw more people at the problem, right? If we just had more people, if we just kind of attacked it full on. Yep. And one of the things that I have been suggesting, both within companies as well as on board, is to focus on capacity. So I'll give you the example of boards, and then I'll give you the example of organizations. So on boards, one of the things that I have been and my colleagues have been doing is we have been working to increase the capacity of the organizations that we serve by bringing our own expertise. We've said to those, for instance, the college presidents or to the CEOs, use us as resources. We've been through crises before. We actually have networks, and we can actually supplement and increase your capacity without you having to feel like you have to take it on your own. And I think this is a really important moment for board members to really be leaning in and helping increase the capacity of the organizations they're aligned with. With respect to organizations, it's a little bit of turning the pyramid on its head. Moving from this strong need and this sense of control, because again, to your point, in the midst of all of this uncertainty, complexity, chaos, what you want to do as a leader, you tend to want to control and to narrow the degrees of control. What I've suggested is you really turn that pyramid on its head and move to a more distributed model of leadership and really use this as an opportunity in a remote setting. And where you are virtual, how do you empower the individuals in the organization? Because a lot of the either innovation, solution, a lot of that is going to bubble up from within the organization. I see it real time in a lot of the, our millennial generation is a generation that understands connectivity, communication in a virtual world better than anyone that I know. So the ability to really ask them, it's like leaders. I've been with some leaders who've been wrestling with culture. How do you create connection, and how do you reinforce and continue to strengthen culture and engagement in a remote or in a virtual environment? And what I've suggested to them is ask people who know how to do this. My daughter, for instance, who has been at home since March in a remote environment from college, she is more connected than ever to her friends, and they've figured out a way. I walked in one day and they were, as a matter of fact, they've found an entire apartment and leased it and they did everything virtually. And I walked in one day and there were 6 of them having a conversation. They've distributed out the tasks that everybody has accountability for. All of that was done virtual. So, this is my point about really embracing, not just talking about distributed leadership, but really embracing it in this moment.
I really love what you're saying, Kaye, about distributed leadership. And this example of your daughter, of course, is, striking and indeed illuminating. I was wanting to ask you a question about 2 things that are in my mind now. One is what you said was character. The other is capacity. They're the 2 C's. The third C, of course, is crises, if you will. So can you share with us, why is it some companies have a character and capacity level that gets them to respond to crises as threats, and other companies say, actually, you know what, the crisis is an opportunity? What is it about their character and their capacity that allows them to see the opportunity side of the crises?
Yeah, this might sound like a pat answer, but it's about leadership. That's the thing that repeatedly I have seen. If you ask me thematically what I've seen in this moment, it's all of the things that, we learn in school, that you guys teach in the academy. It's real leadership. And I make the distinction between leadership with a big L, which is all the things that you learn, which is my title, which is the hierarchy, and small L, which is really understanding that the solutions don't come from a small concentrated group of individuals who are the experts, right? That expertise actually, again, like leadership, is distributed across the organization. And I think this idea of even thinking about, to your point, thinking about character and capacity as ways as levers for unlocking innovation. You get that coming up through the organization, not just because the CEO, had a brilliant spoke of genius. And I think that this moment is just such a moment for us to be thinking about, who are we in terms of our leadership? Are we truly distributed? If I am in this organization, do I really understand what leadership in this moment means? I'm going to connect it to diversity as well, because we couldn't have this conversation without talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right. And Yesterday, I was talking with a client and making the point that the reason to have diverse points of view or diverse individuals is because their lived experience creates with them a context that is different than the prevailing context. So for me, when I think about diversity and inclusion, I'm not thinking about checking the boxes. I'm really thinking that gives me access to insights, to understandings that I just don't have. And I mean, if you want to then convert that into a commercial opportunity, absolutely. That's not where I start. You know, I give you the example of Onyx. Bob, you talked about Onyx. When I started to work with Dr. Tony Coles, who was the CEO there, we had a conversation about diversity, and he said diversity for him was not about a scorecard that was solely focused on representation. He said, here's the premise. We are trying to do something that is incredibly difficult. There haven't been any novel therapies in this particular area in 30 years. And therefore, we need the brightest, most innovative, most creative thinkers to be able to help us solve this issue. So unless you, Kaye, believe that a completely homogeneous group of individuals reflect the brightest, the best, and the most innovative thinkers on the planet, we have to have a diverse organization. And I will tell you, with that fundamental premise for how to approach building an organization, we ended up, and it was one of the most diverse leadership teams I've ever been a part of, and it was one of the most diverse organizations I've ever built. And it was because we started with the premise as opposed to starting with a set of metrics or outcomes that we wanted.
So just to reinforce Kaye's point, I remember this 7 or 8 years ago in Sonoma walking downstairs, and I actually hadn't looked at pictures of the top team. And and I've dealt with a lot of top teams, and the ones I deal with, honestly, are 90% male usually, and especially white male. So I walk downstairs, black CEO, Kaye's black, and half men, half women, half born in the United States, half not. And then I talked to somebody who I mistook, the CFO, and he started talking about his husband. He was one of the few white males on the board. And you guys just did great in that company. So Kaye, there's a number of questions coming in, and there's something that I want to ask about, because at least for me, this is a moment that right now, this is what I'm hearing from the organizations and leaders I'm working with. In fact, recently I had a conversation with somebody who I think used to work for you, and he described how on his fast-growing company, so he's now on the top management team, he wasn't on the top management team in those days, that they all are so stressed that he sent out an email about a presentation at midnight, and he got back 2 long responses at midnight. And he said he realized that something is wrong. So what are you saying with all, because it's a really tough time. Every leader I know is just beleaguered. What are you saying to them about how they take care of themselves and take care of their people for what seemed like a short crisis, but now it seems to be a way of life? What are you saying?
Yeah, a couple of things. So, you know, I start by talking to them about caring for yourself so you can care for others, the old adage. But with people who are incredibly motivated, who are incredibly focused on getting things done, I ask them to approach care of self the same way. And I use myself as an example. So I actually have a very structured approach to caring for myself, because I place that with the same value I do as the rigor that I bring to advising clients, the rigor that I bring to anything. I bring that same level of rigor. So I have a series of practices that I actually use, everything starting with, you know, I literally calendar, what time does my alarm go off? What time do I get up? And the first thing I do in the morning is really care for a set of practices that I know are important to feeding me. So there's prayer, there's meditation, there's some stretches, there's really getting my head ready for the day. And I have also in this moment, and I learned it the hard way, because when we first went to Zoom, I would be on these 12 to 14-hour Zoom days. And I just said to myself, who am I in that moment, right? And how can I coach others or advise others when I was living out of integrity with what I was telling others? So I took a step back and really said, okay, I open up my office between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Are there times when I'm going to have to do something that flexes, maybe because a European team or a team in Asia asks for an exception? Yes, but I'm really clear about how I structure my day. I wear a device. I won't call the name because I'm not advertising for anybody, but I wear a device that reminds me to get up and move, because it's also important for us to move. You see that I'm standing. I have a standing desk. And I'm standing because that also is part of keeping my system whole. And then in the evening, I actually literally close my office door between 5:30 and 6, and I turn off. And again, for my counsel to them is you've got to figure out what works for you, but you can't, for two reasons. Number one, your energy is not inexhaustible. That just is not the case. And then the second is it's the role model that you are setting for the organization in the way that you are adapting. And then the last thing I tell them is it's about being in integrity. So as a CEO, I have one of my CEOs who was talking about the fact that flexibility mattered. It was really key for recognizing that, you know, people who had caregiver responsibilities. And when I say caregiver responsibilities, that's not just children and maybe parents, that's animals that you may have to care for. So, and he would say, you know, people who have caregiver responsibilities, really important to recognize that, be flexible, but he was still sending emails and expecting responses, you know, at all hours of the night. And my counsel to him was, even if you feel compelled to write an email, like put it in draft. You know, send it the next morning. So, and that doesn't mean that because we are in a crisis, there aren't going to be times when you've got to be all on. But I learned this lesson at Johnson & Johnson. We ended up acquiring a company called the Corporate Athlete. And the principle was based on the fact that executives are just like athletes. And if you look at how athletes stay ready, they do a couple of things. One is they focus on food as fuel. So there's a component around nutrition. They focus on movement because, you know, even when they're not on the court or not in actually in game settings, they're still focusing on movement. And then the third is either some form of reflection. That could be prayer, that could be meditation, that could be chanting. But it's the recognition that that's how, you know, top tier athletes care for themselves to ensure that they're always game ready. That's what I'm telling my CEOs. And the last thing I'll say is I tell them, you vote with your time and your money. So if you show me your calendar and your checkbook, I can tell you what you actually value, not what you say you value, but what you actually value.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I love this. I've been watching the chat, as was Bob, and there've been a number of questions, and I thought I'd sort of bring up two of them that I'm sure our viewers would love to know, particularly given your spread of global experience and the fact that you're involved in so many industries. So the question that's being asked is managing crises a one-size-fits-all approach, or do you have to change from country to country? The question was in the developing world. A related question is, and I think this was prompted perhaps by your Spelman discussion, do the ways in which you manage a crisis change from industry to industry? So country to country, industry to industry. What are your views on that, Kaye?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some core principles that are consistent across the board, but there are the nuances that happen. Let's pick country at a country level. I remember being, you know, as I mentioned, I had part of my remit when I was head of HR for that broad geography. Part of my remit was Asia, and one of the countries that we had a very profitable business in was Indonesia. So I spent a lot of time on the ground in Indonesia in the midst of fires and riots and turmoil. And in many instances, people would say that absolutely was a crisis. And we again led with the same kind of principles under 9/11. The first thing was, the safety of our employees. And again, the way in which you execute that at a local level may be different. On the Pfizer in New York, we actually had the capability of understanding where our employees were, even though we didn't have, obviously, the kind of technology we have today. We had better access to understanding that because, for people who were traveling, for instance, we had a corporate travel office and they kept track of all of our employees wherever they were, if they were on a plane or if they were in a country outside of their home country. So we had an easier way of doing that. In Indonesia, that was very much more of a count-in. I remember actually being in the office when we sent everybody out in the parking lot and we literally counted everybody. So again, the premise is still the same. We start with protecting our employees. The second was communication. And, you remember the example I gave in Pfizer in New York, where we wanted to ensure getting communication in through all the channels we could and then getting that back out to employees. In Indonesia, same premise, it was just executed differently. And then with respect to business continuity, it also was, how do we make sure that this disruption, these riots that are happening around us, what do we need to do to protect our assets? So it's the principles, I would say, are generally the same. It's the execution of those principles. And then the last thing I would say with respect to crises is it's really important to be adaptable because particularly in dynamic environments, you can't, even though you may have set the course, you have to be willing and able to adapt because you're not always in control of the context in which you're operating.
Lovely. One quick follow-up from one of our viewers. The questioner or the participant in our webinar works for a very traditional company where the management believes in control. And so the question this person is posing to all of us is, hey, the leadership in my company loves to control things, but we at the bottom levels of the organization see enormous possibilities. What do we need to do to persuade our leadership to listen to us, I think is the question that's being posed.
So I won't be facetious, because if I were facetious, I would say, call me. I probably have a job for you, but I will answer seriously. Look, one of the unlocks that I've found in these moments is actually come up with a specific idea, right? And let me give you an example. So I was talking yesterday with a client, and one of the employees was talking about even the way to think about the company. It's an insurance company, and there was this concept that they actually insure mobile phones, for instance. And one of the conversations we were having was about diversity, and I said, here's an interesting idea. If my phone, right, as a Black mother of Black children, my phone, the phone that my children have, is a lifeline. It isn't just about making calls. It's because when they leave home, I know that that is a way that they can contact me if they're stopped by the authorities, if they break down along the side of the road, whatever is the dynamic that's happening. So that phone is not just to make calls or to text. That phone is actually a lifeline. And if you're an insurer who, you insure, to make sure that phones, when they're broken, they're quickly repaired, that the insurance that you're providing is on par with life insurance, right? And the only reason that you would know that, for instance, is because you have employees of color in your organization who can provide that dynamic to you. So we had that conversation that came up from the bottom of the organization, not from the top. So I think the more you can be specific about the opportunity or the idea, the better it will be, because I do think there are, and that's my point about turning the pyramid on its head, the amount of innovation and insight and ideas that I see manifesting coming up through the organization is really, really, for me at this point in time, it's one of the things that's giving me a lot of optimism because, you know, we so often have bought into this hierarchical way of thinking about leadership. It's why I make the distinction between L, big L, and small L. Small L means that we now have in an organization, I don't know if you have 500 people in the organization, they're not 5 people that are on the hook for delivering great ideas. You now have all of these minds, and you've said to them, you know, we want to liberate you. And I know how hard it can be, particularly on the point around control. One of the CEOs I'm working with has really struggled with remote work, with virtual, because he is still a CEO that believes in FaceTime. You know, I want to physically see people. I want to check the parking lot. Are people still in, our cars still in the parking lot at 5 o'clock in the afternoon? And really coaching him through, how can you be in a, first of all, inquire from yourself why you still are focusing on control, because if if control means that you don't trust the people you have, maybe you should fire all the people you have. Again, I'm not trying to be facetious, but these are the questions that I ask them, because I think what happens so often, we don't get to the beliefs. I spend time with them asking them, what is the underlying belief behind control? What's your insight about why control matters so much to you? And, you know, it's unpacking that creates some access for some of the folks. And then I encourage them to do experiments. You know, have a small team, do something. It's not going to break the bank. It's not going to blow the company up, and it may actually be an opportunity. Bring a group of people together and tell them to share the best idea that they have. You know, in organizations that are not as open to that, experimentation might be a way of doing that.
I love that. Bob, I think we've lost your audio.
Sorry. Is it back?
Yeah,
I think it's back. Yeah. So anyways, I just hit my mute button. So just a comment. Just a few months ago, we were in conversations with an organization that came to Stanford. They wanted to be more innovative, and they described themselves as an organization where everybody wore suits and ties, or the female equivalent. You had to be at your desk, wearing a white shirt, by the way, if you're a man, at 7:30 in the morning, and you left at 5. And that's how that. So I really wonder how they're dealing with COVID, because we were sort of like, I think you're mistaking control for creativity. Okay.
Yep.
So here's a question, and this is a hard question. So this question is, I work for an organization with a management team that is white and Asian. When I brought up the fact that our team does not reflect the community we serve, I was told to focus on diversifying direct service staff. What's your comment on that?
Well,
and advice.
Yeah, you know, so no surprise to you, Bob. That is not the first time that I've heard something like that. That person might even be my client.
So what did you tell your client?
Yeah, look, you know, I'm big on storytelling, because I think storytelling, using my story or my experience, creates an opening and an access for connection, right? Because so much of this work is so much of the inability for others to see themselves in others, that distance. So even that example you gave, that management team, there's no way that management team was able to see themselves in that individual. The distance between, whether that was structural distance or whether that was ideological distance, but the distance between them and this individual was, you know, they couldn't even understand why that individual was asking that question. So my counsel to the person, or at least I'll start with the person, then I'll start with the management team, even though they've neither asked for nor may not appreciate my counsel. But for the individual, I think these are also moments where, you know, you've got to make some really tough decisions. Do you want to stay in the game? And do you want to continue to come forward from a place of solutions? And I really urge people in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion particularly, to really come forward with solutions or with recommendations or suggestions. Because I think what happens is we point out the deficiency. We say the management team isn't diverse enough, or we say that our company isn't diverse enough. And what I help some teams to do is get real about why does it matter. So it could be that you've decided it's a moral imperative. Or you could say, you know, there are significant opportunities that we are missing as a team that we need to be focusing on. I'll give you a couple of examples. Because one of the things I hear a lot of the time is our industry, our company is not customer focused, right? It's not customer facing. So obviously diversity matters, because if you have, if you have a growing demographic that is Asian, Black, Latinx, that you need to be able to access, that you want to respond to or connect with, then of course you are going to, see a closer way of, diversity having an impact on your business. And I use the example of biotech. I use the example of pharmaceuticals. Why should pharmaceutical companies, apart from just the point I made earlier about innovation and about the perspective and lived experience actually around problem solving, that's well documented. I go back to how pharmaceutical and biotech drugs get developed. We have clinical trials, right? And clinical trials historically have been populated with a phenotype that is not diverse. And one of the things that I have argued, and I continue to push for, is including individuals with different genetic makeup, individuals with different ethnicities, because it increases not just the absolute population of individuals you can now access, because there's so many more people on the planet. So your ability to enroll faster and get those clinical trials through the various phases of development faster. That's one piece. The second is the insight, the scientific insight and discovery that you can get access to now, because you're not looking at a monolithic population. So for me, that's on the front end. And then on the back end is the ability to serve historically underserved populations. So it's a complete integrated solution, particularly for biotech and healthcare companies. Diversity isn't just about checking the boxes. Diversity is fundamentally about how you can create greater value for yourself and for patients.
Right. That's wonderful, Kaye. There have been so many questions coming up from your comments. Good. It's like when you offer examples and make observations, there's so many ramps that people are getting onto to ask questions. And there was one question that sort of struck me, and this had to do with the imposter syndrome. So the question is, how do you lead people you suspect have an imposter syndrome? And as a person of color, overcoming imposter syndrome as well?
Yeah, so look, I am a firm believer that using my story, and I'm on my own journey, like we all are. And, there absolutely have been and will probably continue to be points in my journey where that's what encompasses me. And I will tell you that at various points in time, particularly, so just for context, most of my career, professional career, up until just before Onyx, I was either the only person of color, the only woman, and sometimes the only woman of color. As a matter of fact, a little pejoratively, I was in Lynn, Massachusetts. I spent about 6 months in Lynn, Massachusetts. And one of my jobs when I was when I was an HR business partner, and I would say that in order to see another person of color, I had to go into the bathroom and look in the mirror, and so I use that as context to say that there were moments in time when I really questioned, why am I here? Is it, people are going to find out. I'm only here because whatever reason, people are going to find out that, all this persona is not real. that underneath all of this is all of these vulnerabilities, and all of those things are going to come to the fore. And one of the things that became really important, and I continue to use it now, and I always encourage people to do that, surround yourself with people that actually not validate you, but people that you can check in with when you have those moments. That is part of the human condition, right? Unless you are some sort of, you have some sort of psychological disorder that causes you not to have any humility, hubris whatsoever. And I do know some of those people. Some of them are my clients, but I do think it's important to surround yourself, or at least have touch points with people that help you when you are in those moments. And it's not about validating you, but it's really an inquiry with you. Right. What's underneath that? What's causing that to come up? Is there something about this particular situation that you are in that has caused that to happen? When have you been in similar situations? And for me, sometimes it's reminding myself, I lived through and led through 9/11. I lived through and led through 2008. I lived and led through the riots in Indonesia. You know, just reminding myself of those touch points, that when that comes up, that, you know, there is something solid about who I am and what I have to offer. And practicing, not just having people help you with that, but practicing that self-talk yourself is really, really important. I'm teaching that to my kids as well, because as you can imagine, I have a young Black male son. If he took in all of the, you know, perceptions that are prevalent around being a young Black male in America, that can have, I call those micro traumas that ultimately could really do a number on him. So how do I help him when he goes through these moments? Ask those questions. Who are you talking with? Who is inquiring? What is coming up? And really starting to understand, where are those patterns? What's happening in those moments that's causing you? And is it a particular circumstance? For me, I went through understanding, when am I triggered that way? Right. And I used to call it suffer from the expert syndrome. I believed that anything I did, I had to be not just a functional, but a technical expert. And with time, I came to realize that when I was asked to be part of something, I wasn't asked to be a technical expert. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a physician. What I know really, really well, and I continue to study, is leadership, people, organizations, culture. And that's my sweet spot. And I continue to be open to learning in that sweet spot. That's some of the stuff that helps unpack when I find myself going down that path. But I want to reassure the person that doesn't go away because you've arrived or you've achieved something. That's a part of the human condition.
Yeah, I love your candor, and thank you for sharing that experience as well. As I listen to you, and I'm sure some of our viewers also resonated with this, it's almost as though you're saying, look, the real key is curiosity. Yep. And the more curious you are, the more questions you ask, the more liberating it is. Which brings me to a question. I also realize we're at 10:48, and that is, in leading in turbulent times, should organizations invest in the capacity to expect the unexpected? And if so, how?
And that's a good question.
So I would say, I love that question, because it's not in turbulent times, right? When I sit on boards or when I advise, I'm actually asking, and it's interesting, I was thinking about this morning. I'm asking about, what's your business continuity plan? How well do you understand the risk of the business? And I'm not asking that because we're in COVID. I'm asking that in times of quote unquote stability and prosperity. Because if you wait until COVID, you don't have the distance, you don't have the time, you don't have the flexibility and adaptability. You're just reacting. As opposed to, you know, business continuity, I look at that through the lens of enterprise risk management. And when I talk about enterprise risk management for even public or privately traded companies, as you know, there's always the focus on financial risk. We have the audit committee, we have the outside auditors. What I have been pushing to successfully so far to expand the definition of enterprise risk to include culture, talent, and leadership. So every board that I'm on, that is what I'm asking. And it either that then becomes part of the audit committee, or it becomes part of what used to be the compensation committee. But I'm really pushing that because to me, those are fundamental risks to the enterprise. It isn't just about the financial risk, but it's about the culture, it's about the talent, it's the leadership, and recognizing that not just in stable times, those things are critical, but they're even more critical now. Think about the environment we're in right now. So I am actually pushing for that. The last thing I'll say, I'm also encouraging that individually and personally, right? Because right now we find, we're now thinking about those things in this moment. And what triggered it is a good friend of mine yesterday sent me, she's some person who lives on her own, and she sent me her continuity plan for in the event something happens to her. She lives on her own, and in the event she's on her own, here are the detailed instructions, here's the numbers of who to call. And that's, for me, that's not morbid, that's the same degree of preparation. And, there's the financial component to it, there is the familial component to it, who in your family, so I think it's so important. That's one thing that this particular set of crises, because we talk about crisis, but we have an economic crisis, we have a pandemic, so a health crisis, and we are in the midst of part of, in our history as a nation, one of the most divisive, politically divisive times in our history. So in a very short time, we are in an election cycle. So we have, for all intents and purposes, it's the confluence of all of those things that's creating a level of complexity, because they're all interrelated. There's no serial way our individual, let me address this first, address that next.
Right.
What I say, I've told you and Bob, I say, aspire for linear, plan for circuitous and discontinuous.
Right. Right. So you pretend that life is orderly, but you got to deal with the daily mess. That's what you just said.
Absolutely.
That's leadership.
I love that.
That's leadership with a small L. Yes.
So we've got 5 minutes, Huggy. What are interesting questions? What strikes you?
So one thing I'd love the readers to walk away with is our viewers, of course, know that Kaye is an extraordinarily accomplished person who carries her accomplishments so lightly on her shoulders. But the thing that has struck both Bob and I about Kaye, and that's why we admire her, is how much time and effort she invests in self-improvement, in learning, and it's like a continual thing. And, if it's okay with you, Kaye, I'd love for you to share with the listeners here your strategies to learn, where I was like amazed when you told me some time ago that you pick one word and then you spend a lot of time just trying to understand that word. Can you give us an example of a word like that? And that blew me away, I gotta tell you that.
So let me share with you where that comes from, because I think that will shed some light. So as both you and Bob know, I grew up in the Caribbean. I grew up in Barbados, and I was there until I was 19. That intellectual curiosity, that hunger for learning comes from my mother. My mother was one of 8 children. She was the eldest and a female. And at the time, she was taken out of school to help my grandmother raise her brothers. And my mother, from a very early age, instilled in us the value of education and curiosity. And so this focus on continual learning, and my mother, up until she died last year and up until the time she died, there was always a book my mother was reading. And it wasn't just the Bible. My mother was constantly reading. She would read with a dictionary next to her. And it was, so I think a lot of this, I have really, she instilled that in me. And I saw, here is some person who didn't finish the equivalent of high school, but I consider one of the, I consider her to be one of the brightest people that I know because of that interest and that curiosity that she always had, not just through book learning, as she would call it, but just about the world. And, we don't have time, but there's so many sayings that my mother instilled in me that I draw on. And, the words, it's interesting. My daughter's doing the same thing. I'm in my office and I have a whiteboard, and every day I put a different word down. And at the end of the week, I think about, okay, what did I learn about that word? And what does that word mean? And where am I seeing it? And it's everything from, sometimes they're like, really significant words. My daughter put up like la locatia, and I was like, huh? where did you ever read that in a book? It's something that I find for me, and I really encourage people to find what you are curious about. Right. Whatever it is that you're curious about. I'm curious about reading and about learning and self-improvement. What are you curious about? And let that be the thing that causes you every day to commit yourself to being a little bit more curious about the world, right? That's what I would ask people to do.
Fabulous.
So Kaye, we've got 1 minute, and then Robin's gonna take it away. So first of all, we want to thank you for, just as usual, your sort of rambunctious, rambling, wonderful self. So in the final kind of minute here, sort of backing up in this crazy pandemic we're from, if you were going to say, what surprised you the most in a good way in the last few months? So let's end on a positive note.
Yeah. What surprised me most is the uncommon generosity of people. And I see it in big ways and I see it in small ways. I'll give you just a small example. Out here in my neighborhood, we got on the neighborhood app, and all of our neighbors committed every day to purchase meals from our local restaurants to keep them going. They said, if you are a small, if you're a small family, you can't do that, buy a gift card. So this, simple things like that. We have a lending library that started as books. It now has food, it has flowers, and it's just anybody in the neighborhood can just go and pick up or drop off. So the uncommon generosity of individuals. And that's what I focus on. I really focus on that.
That's beautiful. Robin, thank you so much, Kaye. It was just wonderful.
Thank you, Kaye.
You're so welcome. As I said, I always enjoy the two of you.
Here I am, popping back up. That was just a fabulous way to spend an hour. I want to thank all three of you for that. Kaye, thank you so much for joining us. Bob and Huggy, as always, what a pleasure. Thank you everyone who's watching and submitted so many great questions.
Yeah.
Like that was a really nice.
The questions are great.
Yes, thank you so much. And I want to remind everyone that we are going to be sending a recording of this out within 1 week. And so if you're here and you've registered, then you're going to get that recording. And with that, sunny California signing off. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, Robin, for making this happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Continue to be safe and well.
Thank you again, Kaye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Bye-bye.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah.